me, and then I'll have done my job. So I've been studying game birds. Well, I like to say I studied them in high school. I studied the effects of small lead objects on gallinaceous birds with canine pursuit. That was my studies in high school. So, but I came to Utah State actually and did my graduate work here beginning in 2002. I did a little bit of a stint after my postdoc here. So I'm an inbred Aggie, like you wouldn't believe. True blue is probably double meaning there. But I went to Kansas, where I worked for the state of Kansas as their upland game guy for about 4 years, and then I came back, and I've been a professor since 2016 here. And this is what I study. I thought about opening with a prayer for this meeting because this is part of my religion. It runs in our family, right, bud?
Yep.
My little brother here, he came to mock me. But anyways, we'll dive in and we're gonna go over, what kind of happened this season as a way to talk about game bird population dynamics and how things change and that kind of thing. So we'll just dive in here. So the question I want to hopefully answer by the end is, how could bird numbers be so good in 2024-25 season and be so dismal in 2025-26? Everybody kind of experienced this at some level, maybe not.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one.
Yeah,
When
right.
you say that.
Yeah, good. So that was a common sense that I got out there, even from my own experiences. So hopefully we can answer that. I want to start with some data. Here is the upland game harvest. So this is statewide harvest estimates over there in the 10,000, 20,000, so on, for the different species. So chukar are the blue, gray partridge are this yellow, so Huns. Way down here, forest grouse are there in the middle, and red would be our pheasants. So that gives you a sense of overall harvest, and you can see chukar are by far the most up and down, right? And so we'll be talking about them a little bit, but they all have their cycles. And as you can see here, I experienced this. So this is the 24-25 season. It was good. Like, you could hardly go anywhere out there and not run into birds. And man, I tried to hunt so much I almost lost my job, I think, because you just want to take advantage of those seasons. But I think the more important piece of data though is this one, and this is hunter success over those same years. So this is number of birds per hunter season total, and you can see the distribution there. This surprised me a little bit. We have more chukar hunters than I thought, or at least people killed more chukars than I thought out there. But as I looked at these species, I thought about access, right? So in Utah, what do we have access to, publicly? And it kind of, that's it, right? Chukars, we have the most public access to chukars. The next would be forest grouse. Huns are kind of, they're in the middle. There's some public huns, there's a lot of private huns. And then pheasants are the hardest to access for the most part, right? And it kind of distributes like that. But we see these trends, and we see this uptick here in that 24-25 season. You're gonna get a little gratuitous tailgate pictures here, just to prove my point of how good it was. We had some good hunts there over those years on a lot of different species. In those, I would say those, like the 24-25, 23-24, 22-23 seasons were great. But chukars were particularly good. These are from that, not this last season, but the season before. Nobody be counting birds there, because you won't like that. And some of them hunts were just unreal. And that was a great hunt we were on. But, so what I expect though, is with this season, right, that we're going to fall at some level here. And the division is collecting that data right now. mostly this is what my last season looked like. A bird here, a bird there, right? I didn't walk any less. I don't think I hunted much less. But I just didn't get into the birds that I normally would. Now, I'll caveat this. I'm a bird dog guy. I probably wouldn't bird hunt. I bird hunt a couple times a year if I didn't have bird dogs. But with them, if I'm not out once a week, I'm feeling pretty guilty. But there's a good thing about these down seasons. And this is the silver lining in my mind. When a dog starts to really get it, it's often in those really bad seasons that you see them turn this corner and their search gets stronger. And the good ones anyways, some of the best qualities come out in these down years. I just want to throw that out as something, because if you're going to be a bird hunter, you got to be optimistic, a little bit foolishly optimistic about the future and about bird numbers, and you've got to try to see the silver lining in those things. So why did this happen? So we're going to get we're going to get into population dynamics here in a minute, and I'm going to dive deep into some science. You can't read this, unfortunately. It says, "Stop thinking you suck at hunting chukars. You do suck. Just stop thinking about it." I think that should be all our mottos if you're going to be a chukar hunter. Okay, but we're going to go. This is going to make me feel like a college class for a minute. Just bear with me. I'm a professor. I can't help it, right? So we're going to go into Pop Die 101 here. So I'm presenting this model to you. So this is the same population. We have a fall population, right? So this big circle represents the number of birds in the fall population. This over here is the number of birds in the breeding population. Okay? And then this is a cycle. This would be a full annual cycle of the population. And it's easy to understand. In the fall population, you have two types of birds, age classes of birds that are coming into your breeding population. You have your adults that were already breeders, and then you have your young birds that are about to get into their first breeding season. So as a biologist, we call those yearlings, okay? And they're coming in to that breeding period, and that's what that flow is. From here, though, through this, what we call the reproductive contribution or productivity, we've got nest initiation, clutch size, nest success, hatch rate, chick survival early, so early chick survival and late chick survival. I'll explain that in a minute. And then we have breeding adults that make it, right? So this is what we call the carryover birds, okay? That's what we often refer to that as, and they're the ones that survive all the way through. Here's where we focus, though, as hunters, right? And in all my work, I'm in USU Extension, so I'm out there a lot interfacing with people. As a biologist for the state of Kansas, this is where we are focused as hunters. There's a little issue with that, and it's nobody's fault, because I like to kill stuff too, and so that's where we really focus. But the important stuff happens over here for what makes that work. And so hopefully we can learn a little bit about that tonight and get our focus there a little bit more. So I'm going to go through each one of those vital rates that I talked about and just really quickly show you what they are. Okay, so nest initiation rate. What that means is you got a certain number of females in the population, and it's the proportion of those females who choose to go sit on a nest. So maybe you thought that every female game bird out there would sit on a nest, lay eggs and sit on a nest every year. That's not true. It's probably more true for species like quail and pheasants than it is for longer-lived species like sage grouse. So on my sage grouse research, if we got overall around 80 to 90% of our females sitting on nests in a year, that was about our average. Okay, so it's how many of those, proportion of those females that get to this point, that's a sage grouse under a nest. That's really bad lighting. So clutch size is pretty obvious, is how many eggs are in the clutch, in the nest. This varies by species, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. Nest success, it's pretty simple. It's of the nests that are out there, how many of them at least hatch one egg? Okay, so that's our nest success. Hatch rate is the number of eggs or the proportion of eggs in that nest that actually hatch. Okay, not all eggs in a successful nest hatch. There's reasons for that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So this early chick survival, this is when they're cute little puffballs. This is basically hatched to 3 weeks old. Okay, and then late chick survival is from 3 weeks, 4 weeks to when they join the fall population. That's about 12 to 13 weeks old when they get what we call recruited into and fledged. So they leave their brood and they just join the population, the fall population. Here's the reason we do this with chick survival. This is a very normal survival. It's generic, I made it up, but this is a normal population curve for game birds that I've studied. Okay, so they hatch, they're obviously surviving at the time of hatch. And then between there and 3 weeks, there's this really steep curve, meaning they're dying a lot. We're losing a lot. And about there, it evens out, and then we lose a lot less from there forward. Anybody guess why? Why is there this inflection point? At 3 weeks?
Why?
Yeah, they can fly. This is when they can actually get up and fly and get away from predators and that kind of thing. That's what causes this big shift. Up until then, they want to hide. They're listening to mom. They're depending on her and her directions and that kind of thing. But they're a lot easier to catch for mammalian predators and for avian predators. Once they get to this point, they're a lot harder to catch. And it's not very often something dies without something else killing it. There's very little just disease death or exposure death. That's actually pretty rare. We will talk about some of those cases, but we separate those two there. So let's go back to our population model here. And we've now talked about this productivity or the reproductive contribution. I want to put some numbers to it, okay? So these numbers I'm about to present are just generic. They're what I would say, it's not any specific species of game bird, it's just a game bird that is out there, and this would be numbers that would just kind of keep a stable population going, if that makes sense. And I'll show you how that works actually. So we're starting here with our breeding population, and to keep it easy on the math and on my mind, I started with 222 birds in the population for the breeding 222 adults. So that's 111 females, 111 males, right? Most game birds, the males don't do much. There is some exceptions to that, and we can talk about that later. But so we have 111 females. 90% of them put on a nest. That's 100 nests, okay, that we start that breeding season with. At 10 eggs, a nest, 1,000 eggs, right? But only half of those nests are going to be successful, okay? Now, I've talked to a lot of people and they see half and they're like, oh, we got a predator problem. We're losing half our nests? No, half our nests is great. For most game bird population, if you can get half of your nests off, you're doing good. That's just a natural part of the system to have about half of your nests get depredated or predated on. Okay, so that gets us down to 500 eggs. At 90% of those are going to hatch. That gets us to 450 chicks, right? They're leaving the nest. And then with this early chick survival, I'm going to give them a 60% survival, so that's 40% mortality. So we lost 40%, we're down to 270 chicks, and then we're going to lose another 15% in the late survival, so we're down to 230 chicks. I'm given the breeding population, 85% of them are going to make it from spring to the fall population. That's pretty average. So that'd be 190 birds. Those are carryover birds. So the chicks plus the carryover birds, we have 420 birds in that fall population, right? An important metric is how many chicks do we have per adult female? That tells us actually a lot about what's going on in that population. In this case, we have about just over two chicks per adult female, okay? Now, I'm gonna give half of the birds in the fall population, both juvenile and adults, are gonna make it to the next breeding season, okay? Depending on the species, that may or may not match. But you can see now, at 420 and half of them make it, we're back to about where we were, right? So we're about stable, okay? Side note, we may be able to, if we have time, talk about this later, but if we're gonna have impacts from hunting them and having harvest impacts, that's gonna happen here, right? During that period, that has nothing to do with that reproductive contribution. So, here's the math behind it. This is a bit of a busy slide, so just hang with me. What I did is I took all those numbers I just showed you on that model and I put them in, plugged them into the model that would actually run the math on it. So adult survival, the nest initiation, clutch size, and so on. I kept all those numbers the same. And this is what we get out of this. We get our 420 birds. 190 of them are adults and 230 of them are juveniles. So that's 45% of the population is adults and 55% of the population is juvenile. Who wants to hunt that population? There's more than not, right? Would you want more juveniles though? I know I would. I know my dogs would, right? Okay, that's it. 2.4 chicks per adult female. This one is how many adults for every chick. That only becomes relevant if the population goes down quite a bit. And we're at 0.95 as the population growth rate. What that means is 1.0 is a completely stable population. Anything below 0 is a declining one. Anything above 0 is a growing population. Okay? So what happens when we start to boost rates? So here's I'm just taking the results now out of my model to show you so we don't have to look at all that stuff. And this is the standard population with those vital rates that I included. And so that's for reference there. So here's a population where I increased all the nesting rates. So I took nest initiation from 90 to 95, I took nest success from 50 to 70, and I took hatch rate from 90 to 95%. So a little bit of tweaks, I really jumped nest success. And what we have now is quite a bit more birds in the population, right? Even better, 35% are adults and 65% are juvies. Okay, so we have this pipe of juveniles coming in, and our chicks per adult female is up to almost 4. Okay, and our growth rate, we're at 1.24, so we're growing 25% a year, basically. That all make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. So now what I did is I left everything the same, except I increased the chick survival. So I took early chick survival from 60 to 70% and late chick survival from 85 to 95%. How did we do? What would you rather have? Better nesting, right? Than better chick survival, right? Now, obviously we'd rather have both, right? But this does tell you that in this population, given these numbers here, and the traits of this, it's a generic species, but the traits of that species, that nesting is more important to the population than chick survival. Okay? And here I did adults, so I left all the nesting and chicks the same, and I just increased adult survival and juvenile survival. And we got, a fair bit more birds, 516 compared to the 420. Not quite the same as doing the nesting, but pretty good. But look at our ratios here. It's almost half and half between adults and juvies, and we're back down to 2.3 chicks per adult female. That's problematic for the future, right?
Yeah, because the cubbies jump early.
That's one of the reasons, yeah. But we're still growing, so we're not in dire straits at all, because we increase survival. But it's not having the impact that would if we did something about nesting. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about life history, and now we're going to get into the species a little bit more. And I like to do this comparison between bobwhite quail, which is really any quail, okay, and sage grouse. So I'm going to call it fast and slow life history. And what I mean by that is the fast and slow, the speed refers to how fast the population turns over. So a generation time is what we call that in population ecology. So how long does it take to have a generation? So with bobwhites, that means we have large clutch sizes. They lay really large clutch sizes. And if actually bobwhites, if they can, if there's enough resources at the good year, the female will actually lay a nest for the male to sit on, and then she'll go lay a nest for herself to sit on. And that could really get your population going quick. And about in a really good year for bobwhites, about 50% of your males in the population are actually sitting on nests as well. Then they bring that big brood together and raise it together as a group. Now this isn't common. This isn't affecting populations, but it has been shown in some research I was involved in Oklahoma. They had a couple females that bred with 3 different males and laid nests for all 3, and then laid a nest for herself. Okay, those are individuals that. So that's not happening at a but they can do it. The ability's there. Okay. So again, large clutch sizes, persistent nesters. What that means is if they lose a nest, if they get depredated, they will immediately try to re-nest. Okay. If there's resources, then that re-nest should produce quite a few eggs. If there's not resources, she'll have less eggs in her re-nest than she would have in her first nest. And then low adult survival. So in a lot of stable bobwhite populations that I've seen research on, 30% annual survival is normal. Only having 30% of your adult birds make it through to the breeding period is normal, because they can crank out so much productivity with those numbers. Now sage grouse are on the completely opposite end for a game bird. Okay, so this is on the slow end. So they have small clutches. Sage grouse across their range average 6.2 eggs per nest. Don't ask me what a 0.2 egg is. I don't know. They're rarely re-nest. I don't know how many radios. How many radios have I had, Ruger, on sage grouse? Just with you, it's been 100.
Over 100.
Yeah, and then that's my last grad student. Going so lots, and in all that time, I can think of maybe 1 or 2 nests a year that were re-nests, is at most, right? Wayne, did you have any that re-nested?
Half dozen in 2 years.
Okay, so a little bit more. Have you had any?
1 or 2 a year.
Yeah. Now let me tell you how lazy these grad students are. I had to go out on a 4-wheeler and hike with a telemetry set, and they sit at their desk and read a GPS while the data comes in. I'd have been a lot fatter grad student had that. Okay, but they have high adult survival. All right. So a sage grouse, in an annual survival for a sage grouse, is usually upwards of 85% to 90% of the adult grouse are making it through to the next year. In fact, sage grouse hens, if it's not a good year, they may just decide it's not worth setting a nest this year. And we'll talk about this more because they go into high mortality risk. The hens do when they decide to go into the breeding. And they'll just wait till, it's like, I'm going to survive till next year, I'll just wait till next year. And that's been shown to happen in different research. And I saw a little bit of that in my own research. Okay, so now let's go into what factors can actually influence these different vital rates. Weather and climate is, I think we all know that at some level, right? The thing I find with a lot of hunters, upland hunters, is there's lots of kind of far out conjecture about what that actually means, and hopefully we'll clear some of that up. There's lots of things I hear like, oh, we got hail, they're all destroyed, right? Or we got all this periodic rain, they're not gonna be able to nest through all that rain, right? Just different things, and hopefully we can talk about that. The cover, it changes, right? Especially the herbaceous cover. The grasses and forbs changes quite a bit. And then food resources change. Now these aren't mutually exclusive, right? How do we get good cover? We gotta have presets. How do we get good food resources? We gotta have good presets. So these are all entangled. Predator communities. There are instances of predator issues out there, but you may not believe me, but I'm going to tell you, based on the data, predator issues are usually not common or holding a population down. There are instances where it is. If in the literature and the studies we've done, if it is happening, it's almost always localized. It's in one area. And to mitigate that, you have to do very local predator control and get really effective on a really little area. Doing it across a landscape, it's not going to do much for you. That's what the literature says. Also, often I think we conflate predator issues with these because a really hungry chick, a malnourished chick, or adult game bird is a lot easier to catch. Again, nothing's out there starving to death and just flopping over. They're getting hit by something. You know, it's like make me fast for 2 months and run away from a lion. Ain't gonna happen, right? I just won't be able to do it. Competition, and there's lots of different kinds. I'm gonna kind of boil it down here. There's interspecific, so that means between species. I don't know, I'm making this up, but maybe huns and chuckers compete at some level out there for nesting habitat. I don't know. Have any of you watched huns in a game farm pen? They're nasty little things. I mean, they are mean. Yeah, and I was guiding at a place back in grad school, and there's one pair of huns, a male and a female, and there was like 35 roosters in that pen, and all the roosters were up against the wall, faced the other way from the hunt. And if one turned around and looked, both those huns would come over and kick the trash out of that rooster, and then they go. They are so freaking territorial with each other and with other birds. So maybe there's some. I'm just throwing that out. I don't know if there is an issue. I just know huns are mean. They're also very delicious and fun to hunt. There's also intraspecific competition, or what we might refer to as density dependence. So as densities of birds or any population of animals increases, there comes this threshold where there's only so many resources to be had, right? And when they hit that, they just can't keep increasing. There's something that's going to stop it there. But that could be. Well, we'll talk about that when we talk about nesting. And lastly is hunter harvest. If we can over harvest upland game populations, so that is an issue. I don't think that's going on right now, but it is possible. All right, so let's dive into each one of these and talk about what could affect them here. So nest initiation. If there's not enough nesting cover, some hens won't be able to sit a nest. And this goes back to the competition thing. Blue grouse, so that would be sooty grouse and dusky grouse. Now, I just still call them blue grouse, but yeah, they're sooties and duskies. But they're known, the females are known to be territorial with their nesting. So if a female will go out and put a nest down, she's going to keep other females out of that area, and they won't be able to nest there. There was a study done on Vancouver Island, so this would be with sooty grouse, but there was enough birds that the whole island had nesting territories on them, and there was like, don't quote me on this, my memory says like 25 to 30% of the females in the population, especially the younger females, never nested because they couldn't find a nesting territory. And it was an island, so they couldn't just,
How big of an area is that?
Vancouver Island?
No, general.
I don't remember off the top of my head. I've studied duskies up here. I haven't seen densities high enough to start to see females chasing each other out. But I have seen in the spring, like we'll do a female call in the spring to try to get males to sound off so we can count them. And doing a female call, another female will come in and try to chase us off. And we can actually noose them and put a radio on. We've done that. But yeah. So there's still some. I've never played or had a sage grouse female noise and had another female sage grouse come and try. That's very. I think that's very specific to the blue grouse. But again, not enough nesting. This breeding territory thing. And the last one is what you can't hardly see it. Pre-laying habitat is what we call that. Or what that means is, as these females in these different species, as they go to nest, they have to have a certain amount of nutrients to be able to form their eggs. And some of that is just overall energy and protein and that kind of thing. But some of that for eggs specifically is calcium and phosphorus, right? To be able to form those eggs. And so if there's not enough of that nutrient in the pre-laying habitat, then it's going to really hurt the initiation. And that's where I think in some bad years, like I told you about sage grouse, they may not nest because they're just not getting enough nutrition out of that. And so pre-laying is happening in March and April and early May. So it's those little forbs and grasses that are just coming up right now, from now until May, that create that pre-laying habitat. Okay. Yeah. So clutch size, it varies by species. So here we've got a pheasant, a chucker nest, a rough grouse nest, a dusty grouse nest, and a hun nest. Okay, so these are based on the literature and studies that have been done. These are the ranges and average. So for a pheasant hen, the range is 8 to 15 eggs per nest, average is 11. For chuckers, it's 10 to 20 eggs per nest, average is 15. For huns, it's 10 to 22, average 16. So one thing about these two is it depends on the year. So if they're having a good spring, a good year, they're going to go more towards this end. And if it's not so good, they're going to go more towards this end. Okay. Rough grouse are 4 to 19. That's a wide range. Average is 11. And for dusty grouse, it's 4 to 12. And we saw 6 or 7 in almost all of our nests. So they're a lot more like a sage grouse in their life history than the rest of these. And it's a concern I have because birds that have this life history, like a rough grouse, they have high productivity, low annual survival. They can handle a lot more harvest than dusty grouse that have long-lived and lower reproductivity. But how do we hunt them here in Utah and most of the West, right? They're an aggregate. And so at some point that could become a concern. So again, pre-laying matters on number of eggs and those conditions going on. And then renesting matters. So on this end, dusty grouse bluegrass aren't known for their renesting. Rough grouse are. Rough grouse are incredibly plastic in their nesting. So if they don't pull a nest off in May, they might pull a nest off in June. And have you ever been out there opening September 1st and they're like 6 weeks old maybe, and you feel bad shooting them? They taste good, and the likelihood of them surviving is lower than that bigger hen. Just don't shoot the hen. That's where you hurt things. So don't feel guilty. Okay. So that's clutch size, what affects clutch size. So nest success. The climate and weather during incubation. This is really interesting. And it kind of varies by species. But in general, if we get like a rainstorm that comes in and just soaks and sticks for like 2 days, and it's cold and it just sits and rains and rains and rains, that will cause hens to lose their nest. We don't know if that's just them trying to thermoregulate themselves, or if because they're wet, it's easier for predators to detect them odor-wise, that kind of thing. Or maybe they're moving more on and off their nest to deal with the rain. I don't know. But we do know that can hurt. Also, and I've seen this with blue grouse, storms that come in, I'm like, this is perfect for chucker, right? It's coming across the desert. It lays some rain. It doesn't sit around. It just creates a little bit of moisture. What does it do when it hits the mountains up here? Freaking 3, 4, 5 inches of snow, right? In those cases where I've had radio marked birds up there, with sitting on nests, most of the time we lost those nests when we got that much snow on top of those grouse. So that was something to kind of think about and look into. Overall cover, game birds of all kinds, they need cover. It's interesting how they use it. Blue grouse are really interesting because you might see them just up against a tree. They look like they're completely open and they're just like up against the bark. They're still hard to see, but you almost see them. Like one study showed that if you had a log, a lot of them were nesting under a log. Okay, I guess, right? In my experience though, we've seen those things, but a lot of our dusty grouse look just like a sage grouse nest. They are out of the forest. They're 200-300 yards, and they're just in a big sagebrush flat that can equally have sage grouse there as dusty grouse, and that's where they're nesting. I call dusty grouse the prairie grouse of the mountains. While they need trees during the winter, and they feed on pine needles all winter long, all the rest of the year they're kind of playing this between the trees and then the shrub and steppe habitat. It changed my hunting.
Don't get into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't tell them.
Well, that's the only reason we're here.
We found that our broods that we had radios on, they were spending 60 to 70% of their time out of the trees in the sagebrush, especially if that sagebrush was near enough the aspen, but also had other mountain shrubs in it, like serviceberry and that kind of thing. They were spending most of their time there. And I grew up hunting sharptail in North Dakota. That's exactly what it felt like, was going in those, which it completely changed. And my shots on dusty grouse got so much easier than when they were in the trees. So think about that. I've already published it in an old online free paper. Okay. Hen experience and age matters. So if you're on the quail side of things, on a really fast cycle, that doesn't matter because you don't have enough older ones making it to make a difference. But if you're like on the sage grouse end, we know, and my studies have shown this, if you're a first year hen, you're not going to nest as successfully as a second year hen. It gets even better. There's been some studies that have shown for sage grouse, a yearling hen, so they take nest respites. What that means is as they're nesting and sitting there, in the mornings and the evenings usually, right at that dark period, they leave the nest and they go defecate and feed a little bit and then come back, okay? The yearling hens in the mornings had a real irregular schedule. They might leave half an hour before the sun came up. They might leave when the sun came up. They might leave half an hour after the sun came up. They were really irregular on that. The 2-year-old hens and older, they left at the same time every day. It was always in the dark, and they came back almost in the dark. So you think about a raven, a visual predator, right? Being seen, being detected, not going to happen in the dark. It will happen in the light, right? And so, just some really interesting things to consider. Also, we found that adult hens, sage grouse hens, were much better at keeping their chicks alive. And I don't know if they stole chicks or chicks just recognized they were better moms or what, but they would have a lot of chicks mixed into their brood, and they would raise more chicks that way. So there's a lot to do as you get into these longer-lived species with age. Again, pre-laying resources matter. This gets really interesting. There's been some studies on different species that show that if the hen has more nutrition, she'll produce a bigger egg. Okay? If that bigger egg has a higher chance of hatching, and once it hatches, it has a higher chance of surviving as a chick. So what starts clear back in the spring before they even nest matters come August. Right. Sorry, I'm nerding out here. Just bear with me. Predator community can matter. And I mentioned like ravens. That would be one exception to my rule, that predators don't matter that much and habitat's more that matters. But ravens are at closing in on 700% of their natural densities, and they're trouble. They're also protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And there's people right now working on this issue trying to overcome being able to control ravens better. Renesting then matters, because if you're a persistent nester, then your nest success is going to go up just by chance that you're putting another nest out there. And I will say this about nest success, sometimes it just seems random. I don't know how to explain this. Some of the best nests have the best cover, get hit. And we had one sage grouse nest next to the road in a Great Basin Wild Rye, literally next to the main road by Grouse Creek, and she survived. It was like, how did she survive? She hatched her chicks and went up the mountain. So there is some randomness to it all. All right, hatch rate. So climate during laying. And what we don't realize, hens don't go sit on a nest and go pop, 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 and they got their eggs, right? They lay an egg and a half per day is their average. So if you have 10 eggs to lay, you've got 15 days to lay those eggs, right? What's that? Sorry, you're right. I went the wrong way with it. 7 to 8. And so, but over that week period, the climate could completely change, right? And they don't start incubating until all the eggs are laid, and then they start incubation, and that's what creates the hatch to happen at the same time. So those eggs are just laying there. The first egg that got laid, I'm getting tongue twisted here. It has a much higher chance of freezing out. It could be completely fertile, but you had a night freeze or 2 nights in a row or something like that, then it may not hatch, right? When I was doing my work, I thought every unhatched egg was infertile, but it's pretty rare to have actually an infertile egg, sorry. And so, there can be fertilization issues, especially as populations get small and inbreeding coefficient, so there's less genetic diversity in the population, then you can have some fertilization problems. So early chick survival, so this is hatched to 3 weeks. This is killer. It's the climate during these first 3 weeks. There can be some exposure that happens at this time if things get too cold, but I'll just tell you a little story quick. I had a bunch of little chicks. These are chucker chicks, but I had a bunch of little sage-grouse chicks. They're like 30 grams, they're like that big. And I put radios on them to measure their survival, and we were following around. And we were about 10 days into the hatch, so my birds had been hatching. I had 10 to 12 broods, somewhere in there, on the landscape, and a snowstorm came in and laid down 3 inches of snow. And I was like, they're all dead. Like they're this big, they're all dead. And that snow stuck around for 2.5 days. I made sure I watched it. And I went back out thinking all my chicks were gonna be dead. I had about 60 chicks in all those broods. 1 had died, that's it. So mom took care of them, tucked them up, and they must have had enough. So that yolk sac they actually take with it. It creates some nutrients for them for those first few days. There might have been that going on too. So that's important. But most important is forbs and insects abundance. So chicks. So here's like a Mormon cricket, or when you have these exceptional years of cicadas, or those kind of things, that can be an incredible. You may not have the best precip or anything, but those can really get your, or these grasshopper years. Did you guys notice 2 years ago? I mean, my lawn looked awful, right? My garden was even worse, right? But there was just grasshoppers everywhere, and it started in late May, and it stayed through September and into October, right? That's a smart. That's like, yeah, you hook those chicks up to protein. They're fine. And I want to go to this predation or lack of food. I've been hitting this, but I think lack of food has more to do with predation than just predation in and of itself. It's a bit of a Goldilocks thing, though. Got to find that right, just right? Can't be too hot, can't be too cold. Whoops. Late chick survival, a lot of similar things going on. One thing we found, and I've seen in the literature, this is turkey, sage grouse, and some pheasants, I think. These late summer rains, like monsoon rains and stuff, they can come in and soak the chicks, and then the chicks will actually go out in the open to dry off, and then they'll get hit. Okay? So in some of my work, we saw these increases in mortality later in the summer if those rains were associated with it. Forbs and insects are still really important, but they're starting to rely more on the vegetation than they are on the insects. So if you don't leave with anything, leave with this tonight. This is my family mantra, okay? April showers bring May flowers bring June bugs, and June bugs bring September chuckers. Okay? That wraps up this whole principle, kind of. And again, back to the predation lack of food. So I would apply this to most. This is sage-grouse data specifically, but I would apply it to most game birds of the distribution of their diet. So if 100% is all their diet, for sage-grouse from week 1 to 3, most of their diet is forbs and insects. It's about half and half. They need that insects for the protein to grow those wings so they can fly and get away from predators. That's aid number one for growth. As they continue, by about week 10, they're weaning, they're just not eating as many insects. There's not as many insects out there though, either, right? And they're continuing their form, and they add a little bit of sagebrush to their diet. Not all birds add sagebrush. That's unique to sagebrush. Okay, so what's affecting the adults then? So again, we got to get back to this climate and weather. We do have some issues. We can have some issues with fall coming into the breeding period. Snowpack, there are years where we get so much that chuckers and huns suffer. What was that? 23, 24?
23.
22, 23 was the horrible one? Yeah. There was, I mean, people were taking pictures in Box Elder, East Box Elder, all these birds on the roads and stuff. And we do lose adults to weather, to high snowpack. Pheasants can usually do good, but I grew up in North Dakota and there were years that it got too cold and too snowy. And pheasants are kind of stupid. I know this is pheasant forever, I'm sorry. But they'll go out sometimes and just stand there in like a sleety rain and just their nostrils will freeze shut and they'll suffocate to death and die. I'm just, I don't get it. But, anyways, rough grouse. One thing that can happen with rough grouse, they snow burrow at night, every night during the winter. And if they can't get under that snow, there's not enough snow, they're going to have a hard time surviving in the winter. However, if there's enough snow and it crusts or freezes over, then they can't get back out. And that can reduce your overwinter survival for rough grouse. It's also important to realize that bad breeding conditions also make for bad survival for the adults. If you're not getting enough forbs and grasses and that kind of thing for your chicks, that means the adults aren't getting very much either. And you can have that breeding to fall this here, just the natural mortality can weigh on those your carryover birds. Now breeding females go to a pretty high mortality risk. When they're in the fall and the winter, they're flocked up. And some species are, females kind of go with females and males go with males. Some species don't do that. But when they're in this group, I mean, you think about it. If there was 10 of us in this room and a lion's coming, what's my chance of dying? 10%, right? If there's 20 of us in this room and a lion's coming, what's my chance of dying? 5%, okay? So it's pretty simple math, actually, that when you're in these bigger groups, you're gonna survive better. But when you go to be to have chicks, they completely separate from the group. In fact, our number one way of knowing that a game bird has lost its brood or stopped nesting and isn't in that reproductive cycle anymore is when they join other hens. We know that's it. They're not part of it anymore. Okay? So when these hens, they do this for a reason. When you're in a big group, you may have a less chance of dying if a predator comes, but what do you have as far as the group getting detected by a predator? You have a lot higher chance of getting detected so there's this balance there. She wants to minimize the detection by the predators on her. Because if she has eggs or chicks, that makes them vulnerable. But she's putting herself then at the highest risk. And I've watched it happen. Well, I've been chased myself. Catching chicks, sage-grouse chicks, put radios on them. I had hens flying at me, squawk, hissing. Do you know a sage-grouse could hiss like a snake? I didn't know that. So they did. I had a blue grouse punch me in the chest when I was trying to get her chicks. They get really protective of the chicks. Not all of them are that protective, but they put themselves at risk. There was multiple ones I was like, man, if I was a coyote, you'd be done. So their survival definitely drops when they're in that breeding phase. There's a sweet little thing that happens. In some of my work, I found that brood mixing happens. So chicks that are born to this mom join this brood over here, and that kind of thing. And in every case, both bluegrass and sage-grouse, where the mom brood, the brood hen dies, her chicks are picked up by another hen within 48 hours. I've always thought if we lost mom, we'd lose the chicks, right? They'd just be done. I've never had it. They've always been picked up by another. That's even in North Dakota sage grouse where there's almost no birds left on that landscape. Even there, we lost a brood hen, and another brood hen came along and picked up those. So that chick calling, that mother instinct is just, it's pretty amazing actually to watch. And the whole idea, it takes the village, that's happening out there on the landscape. Okay, food and insect abundance is still important. So I showed you that chick diet. Here's sage grouse diet for adults. So in the winter, it's almost all sagebrush. But when you get to the summertime, spring and into the fall, we start to pick up a lot of forbs and a little bit of insects. So those adults are still doing that. By the way, sagebrush secondary compounds, so the poisons, Dale, you know all about this. You want to talk?
No, that's
No?
okay.
So the sagebrush has terpenoids that are poisons. Most animals can't eat sagebrush. Sage grouse have this evolved gut to take the poisons out, and they, what is our appendix, they're cecum, and they take those poisons out. If you've seen that black tarry stuff out there when you're hunting sage grouse, it's called a cecal dropping, and they get rid of that. And sagebrush is really nutritious if you can deal with that stuff. But where does sagebrush reach its peak in terpenoids, Josh?
Late winter.
Yeah, late winter and into this period. So they're coming off of it right when sagebrush is at its having its peak terpenoids. All right. Again, predation or lack of food question. Hunting harvest can be an issue. Okay. So I'm going to go into this last year. So this is data from, I won't tell you where, but it's from some areas I hunted charters. Okay. And it's the black line is the 2025 growing season, and the blue line, this one's 2024 compared to 2025, and this is 2023 compared to 2025. And so this is a growing season. So the growing season starting here and coming through September, October, and this is the productivity of the herbaceous. So this is the grass and forward productivity. Okay. The first thing I want you to notice is the peaks. So in 2025, we peaked back in mid-May. Okay, mid to early May, actually, and then it started desiccating. Did it rain last summer after May? It didn't hardly rain at all. It was just straight down. In 2024, it peaked closer to the end of May, getting into June. But see, well, I'll do that in a minute. 2023, we have a similar displacement of where it peaked. And 2023 was actually a little bit later than 2024. So that's the next thing I want you to notice is this is saying that things are greener and being more productive out there than in 2025. And look at the period of that greenness and that productivity. Same in 2023, it's actually a little bit longer. When do chuckers hatch? Right there. So you see, in 2025, you've already started your downward trend in desiccation, and you're not getting productivity. And in 2024 and 2023, we were having these longer extended periods of that greenness. I don't know if you remember 2 years ago, but it was green into August out there on the landscape. And that's the difference that's going on there. The last thing I want to mention, before I have you try to answer the question, is when we have these really big years, it's usually at least 2 years of buildup to have that big year for a lot of game birds. So here's, this is productivity at an area out in the West Desert here. This is 14, 15, 16, 17, and 2018. And then here's harvest, and here's the same years through harvest, okay? So 2017 was a really big year. And we see this climb in primary and productivity out there reaching to the peak of harvest and that lining up. So there's this thing called population momentum. As things get going, you need that momentum to make those big leaps. You're not necessarily going to go from an all-time low to an all-time high in 1 year. It just can't happen. You think about that cycle we took you through with number of adults and the reproduction. They need that momentum to get going to pull off those big years. And you can see, I didn't pull this data, but you can see that same thing here for the 2024-25 season. So we have these ups and downs in Gamebird's populations. However, if you think about, I'm taking you back to this model that we started with, this standard model, and you look at all these different things, it's easier to go down. You think about all the risks out there on the landscape, all the things that could go wrong, the whole Goldilocks principle, right, of getting it just right. A lot can go wrong. However, for this model, I put in really high numbers for everything. Let's just call it a really good year, right, that we have out there. So things can turn around really quickly, and that's the cool thing about Gamebirds. So I want you to notice, with the average, we were getting like 520 birds in the fall population. In a really good year, that's almost 1,500 birds. That's incredible. If you really start to think about what these birds can actually do. Even better, 23% of the population is adults and 77% are juvies, right? That's a good thing. We have almost 7 chicks per adult hen, and our growth rate is, we're tripling our population. So I didn't want to leave you with just the pessimism. Things can turn around, and they do, and we've experienced those. It's important though to take advantage of it when it's there, because next year could be a bust, like we've seen. All right, so can you answer this question? How could bird numbers be so good in 24-25 and be so dismal this last year?
Sounds like a lot of things need to go right to make it right. And it's pretty easy to go wrong. So
Yeah,
I don't know if there's one thing you can nail it on.
there isn't. That's a good answer. Yeah. There never is really one thing. It's this combo. It's the same thing for when things go right. It's a combo, and and this last year it went really wrong because we just didn't. Nothing can make it without rain from May to September.
I think it's interesting. It didn't just like gradually go down. It just whoop,
Yep.
dropped right off.
I'm surprised it actually stayed as high as it did, based on my experience out there. But do you at least feel like you're better prepared to answer that question? I hope so. If I didn't, I failed you. Okay, I do want to. I'm just about an hour. I just want to talk about a couple of things here. When we think about population growth, this is for any population of anything. We go through this growth curve. This middle of the growth curve. So this is population size over time. This is the highest growth rate. This is when things are growing the fastest, right? And then we have this carrying capacity that we talked about before. Without carrying capacity, we don't have density dependence. And if we don't have density dependence, we don't have compensatory harvest. So the whole idea that we harvest that it doesn't affect the population is we're taking out animals that would have died anyways through the winter, right? But if this doesn't exist, then that's density independence, that can just keep going. And then what you're taking out is additive, right? So we have to know those things. There, in probably I would say the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, the thoughts around game birds that was being taught was that this is always the case, we always have density dependence, and all harvest is compensatory. A lot of the more recent research though has shown different cases where that may not be true. The one old study was this bobwhite study, but it was out of southern Wisconsin. So when the winter came, the bobwhites went, they had the bottleneck. Have you been to Oklahoma in January? Is there much of a bottleneck out there? Birds, the bottleneck for bobwhites in Oklahoma is actually summertime when it gets so hot that they can only use a tiny portion of the landscape, and that's when they die a lot. So it's actually a completely different system. But we're starting to understand that. Older studies also did not account for immigration, so animals coming outside into the population or leaving the population to go to another population. So there's some issues there. I'm not going to dive too far into that. I did want to bring up this though to kind of show you what carrying capacity can look like. This is pheasant harvest from 57 to 2023 in Kansas. So we're anywhere between 500,000 and 800,000 roosters shot a year. But carrying capacity isn't this line, it's this area. So every change here is this interannual variation, right? A little bit better here, a little bit worse here, a little more nesting, a little less. And like in Kansas, if they harvested wheat too early, because the wheat matured early, there was a lot of pheasants that nested in the wheat. They actually don't nest much in the CRP out there. It gets too hot in the CRP. So they nest in that green, that winter wheat. But we see this up and down. But then there was this late 70s, early 80s thing that happened. And we rivaled South Dakota in those years, or Kansas rivaled South Dakota. So what's going on? I don't know, but that's more of a density independent thing that was going on. There was nothing capping carrying capacity those years, and I can guess, but it's important to know that this is a very simplistic state of carrying capacity. In real life, it often looks like this. It's this variation year to year. I want to talk about limiting factors. So every population of wildlife has a limiting factor out there. What's holding it back, right? So we have these different things like amount of nesting habitat, amount of connectivity to other populations, brooding habitat, low precip, you're just in the mosaic area, winter habitat, and harvest rate, right? We have all these different things. And you think about filling up that barrel, the amount of water in that barrel is the size of the population, right? But if you have these different size slats, so this represents, a decent amount of nesting habitat, but not totally the top, right? Harvest rate is pretty low, so you're okay. But brooding habitat, right, is pretty low. So if you were going to fill that barrel with water, how far could it fill? To the top of the brooding habitat, right? And then they can't go any further, right? So that's a limiting factor for this population. And that can change, what that is can change by population. But it's important to understand that when we're trying to do management, we're trying to do things out there, we have to understand what these limits are. Because you could be working on harvest rate and cutting harvest rate in an area. It doesn't matter, right? Or you could be working on getting better nesting habitat. But if you didn't fix this one, it doesn't matter the other things that you're doing out there. All right. I want to use this example really quick because it's really interesting to me. So if you look across, and I'm just talking about pheasants now. If you look across the Midwest, so this is the heart of pheasant country, right? Let's not pretend Utah's in it. Okay? This is the heart of it. I grew up right there. So on this, we have this east-west gradient, and that's what amount of precip is on this gradient, where we get more precip here and less here, okay? Now this is some data out of Iowa, a colleague of mine, Todd Bogenschutz. So he found, he was the Iowa pheasant biologist, he found that if winter snow was less than 30 inches and spring rain was less than 8 inches, Iowa always increased their pheasant population. Okay, so they were precip limited from the top down. I worked in Kansas at the same time, and I was dumbfounded because in Kansas I can never get enough snow or enough spring precip. Excuse me, to get our pheasants going. So we were limited on the other end, right? These gradients exist all over out there, and we'll talk about one more example. But where do you think the best pheasant climate is year in and year out?
I was going to say in between Iowa and South Dakota, right there in the middle.
Yeah, there's a reason South Dakota's nobody comes close. And it's not releasing pheasants, okay? I know they do, I know there's that whole thing, but that's not it. They're a pheasant factory. If I had to pick the perfect factory to build wild pheasants, grow wild pheasants, it's right there. Just like spring after spring, summer after summer. Cool, they have enough cool season grasses for the nesting, that the hens don't get too hot. And they have enough warm season grasses to support the birds through the winter and not get cool season grasses often get crushed by the snow, right? And they have a lot of cactus when it gets really bad. Okay, so it's interesting to think about these limiting factors in this way. Out here, I wonder if it's not this though. It's not an east-west gradient, it's an elevation gradient. So where I often see is if my dusky grouse and rough grouse are doing really good, the desert birds may not be doing that great that year. Like I was talking, you can have these spring storms that come in, they're really good for chukar, but they're really bad for the forest grouse, right? Unfortunately, this last year they were both bad, and I don't know how. Yeah.
What about 2 years ago? Two
Yeah.
seasons ago,
It was
every
great.
single species was up.
Right. So yeah, it's not. Well, you can have the same thing happen out here where Kansas gets a lot of rain and Iowa doesn't that year for whatever reason, and then they both go up. But I think this kind of gradient, I would just turn it elevationally. Have you think about that as you think about how do we predict bird numbers? Are we going to have a good season? Or more importantly for me, I travel to bird hunt, so if they're not good here, I'm just going to go over there. Because there's somewhere in the world it's going to be good. Right? I'm just going to hit a couple myths and then we'll quit. So I did want to, there's a couple bird hunting myths I want to hit. So double clutching fantasy. How many of you have heard of double clutching? How many of you said they must have double clutched this year? Okay. You're wrong, sorry. They don't. It doesn't happen. There's not one study where they've been following the hens, and what I mean by double clutching is she raises a brood, leaves that brood and goes raises another brood. There's just not enough time for it to happen. Not only that, there's usually not enough resources. So by the time that brood is raised, the resources that she had to build that they're gone. Okay, so double clutching doesn't happen. What can happen is what I told you about bobwhites, is that she can lay a nest for herself and for a male, and that's a different. I wouldn't call that double clutching as the myth. That can happen. What's interesting right now, as far as the research goes, we don't know if other quail do that or not. We know other quail males are involved with the brood. California quail males are involved in raising the brood. It makes sense to me then that they could sit a nest. And I'm not sure, I can't remember right now how much they have males trading off with the female in the nesting. But that may be happening, but I haven't seen the research on it. I'm only suggesting this, okay? So don't run with this and go wild. But there may be some evidence coming out that chukars might have males sit on nests and females too. That would explain a lot of some really good chukar years. But we don't know yet. There's just some evidence that may be true. But we need to do more research. And I would think if it's good for huns, it's good, or good for chukars, it's probably happening with huns.
Maybe your doctoral students need to figure that out.
Yeah, I just need some pay that doctor. Unless Weaver wants to stick around for a long time. Okay. Good fall habitat isn't necessarily good spring habitat. This is something I deal with all the time. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I was taken by some guys up towards Oakley, Utah, and they went out there and they wanted to start a pheasant population up there. In Utah. You guys been there, right? By Camas, 6,500 feet. We went out there and they said, "See all that cattails? Perfect pheasant habitat." I just kind of laughed. It's like, well, you know, cattails are good winter habitat for pheasants, but cattails have to have their feet wet in the spring. They have to have water running through, and pheasants can't nest in water. And but their point of view was, well, we hunt pheasants and that's where we flush them, so that's good habitat, right? But they weren't thinking about all these other requirements. Besides the fact that almost all your really good pheasant populations, and I'm referring to big landscape like across the United States, are associated with grain crops. And really your best ones are if you get 50% grass and 50% grain crop, row crop, that's where your best pheasant population is going to be. Right there. Okay? I think that's good. I've gone long enough. I have more. That'll be another time. Any questions or yeah?
Like I noticed, like this year, like shark tail there was more sharp-tailed than any other bird out there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there a reason why they did so well? Well, maybe that was just what I seen, but
I think my experience was there's a lot of carryover sharp-tailed. What I mean, I saw a lot of adult sharp-tailed in my bag. Also, our native birds, our native grouse, are a little more resilient to the weather changes than our non-native birds, and they're just a little more. They have a little more ability to handle some of those harsher conditions that they evolved with.
because you always think, because it's limited tags and all this, in Utah anyways, you think, oh, limited harvest and all that, maybe that helped, but
I think
Idaho
you need
was
to take
just
me
as
to
well.
where you were getting into those. And yeah.
I've always heard that hand-raised pheasants released out in the wild they don't nest.
They do nest.
Predation, predators take them like crazy. So what are the real facts?
Yeah. I would first refer you to Pheasants Forever has a whole webpage about this, and it's great. It's perfect information. It's right on. This has been across multiple studies, multiple species, of game birds. They're raised in a pen and released. 96+% of those birds are dead within 2 weeks. They have no idea how to stay away from a predator. The only way a chick game bird knows how to stay away from a predator is that mom taught them how to stay away from a predator. And there's some really cool research that was done in Sweden, I think. These were black grouse. And they had a black grouse female that was raised in a pen, and she hatched chicks in the pen. And then they had a black grouse female that was in the wild, that had chicks raised in the wild, and they caught her when her chicks were young and brought her into a pen. I don't know where they got the funding for this, but they built this room, like where the grouse were, and they had vegetation in there that they could hide and stuff. And then they had these tubes where they would release a red fox to run through the tubes. And then they were watching the behavior. And what they found, and this is a sample of 1 or 2 really, but what they found was that when the red fox came through with the captive female, and she made the call, like she did her brood call, that was instinctive, and the chicks froze to that call, just like you would in the wild. The problem is they only stayed frozen for like 2 seconds, and then they started moving around again in the presence of the fox. The fox was still in the tube. Couldn't get at him, but was there. On the wild side, when they did that same reaction, hen gave the call, chicks froze, but the chicks didn't move until mom gave the release call. And she wouldn't give that call until the fox was out of sight. And that explains so much about what's happening out there. And that same principle applies to a lot of things. So the other thing is the few birds that are released and do make it to the spring, they're pen reared, they'll nest as readily as a wild bird. That is just built into them. They'll hatch as readily as a wild bird. But what they don't do is raise chicks very well. So what happens is, and this I'm telling you most of this from a Bob White study that was done in the southeast. This is across like 3 plantations in 7 years. And what they did was they had a group of Bob White that were just pen reared. They grabbed them, released them. Then they had a group of Bob White that they caught in the wild, and put radio on the chicks and followed the chicks, and so they knew what was going on in the wild. Then, as they were finding things out, then what they did is they got another cohort of Bob White, and these were wild trapped eggs. So they went out and raided nests, and they brought them into an incubator, because when they were studying the wild birds, they put a recorder at the nest with and what they found was the female in that last week of incubation was making these calls, and the chicks were calling back, and they're called hatch synchronization calls, and it's the start of the imprinting process that gets mom and the chicks synced up and imprinted on mom. It's also what makes the chicks hatch within a half an hour of each other. Without those calls, the chicks will hatch over like an hour and a half, 2 hours or more. That's death for a game bird to be sitting on a nest that long, and the chicks are moving around. they gotta get going. So what they did is they brought these eggs in, and then they recorded those calls, and they played the calls in the incubator to these chicks. And guess what? They all hatched within a half an hour. So they had way more chicks on their hands. And then they brought male bobwhite in, and they built pens with wild habitat, big pens. They put curtains up, and it was a no-talk zone, so there was no human voices. And they adopted the males to the chicks. And these are wild males raising these chicks in these pens with no human interaction. Then they measured survival. So when they released the pen-reared birds that were just pen-reared, they had less than 10% survival in the first 2 weeks. When they had the wild birds, they had 45% chick survival in that same period. These birds that were wild caught and imprinted had 43% chick survival. So that whole imprinting process that's missed with the regular game bird productivity, it just makes it so these chicks have no real chance. So when they go to nest, they don't know how to call to their chick because they were never called to. It's really interesting. So imprinting there's parental imprinting, but these chicks that are born in a hatchery all together, they call it cohort imprinting. So they actually imprint on each other. So when they have chicks, they don't see the chick as a parent to offspring. They just see it as another bird. So they don't brood it. They don't try to protect it. They don't do any of the mothering things. And that all breaks down. And then, so no pen-reared female that made it to the breeding season and nested successfully raised a chick in 7 years. None of them. The ones that were artificially imprinted on, and they made it to spring, they nested successfully and raised their own chicks and added to the population. The problem is, it cost $128 a bobwhite to do that. Doing that at scale is tough.
So if you lost a wild population of birds, the only way to replace them is with wild birds.
Or do what I'm telling you,
Imprint 'em,
How they
all that.
establish the populations in the beginning?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Dale. So I got looking at that when I was in Kansas, because this is always coming up. Well, that's how they started, right? They had all these release programs, right? And did you know that they had egg programs in almost every Midwestern state where once the farmers were done with their chickens, they'd ship them pheasant eggs from the state, and they'd raise the pheasant chicks and let them go to just try to boost pheasant populations. What they found, though, was that those birds weren't surviving. So when the biologists would have good habitat, like here's some good pheasant habitat, they started going back to Willamette Valley and catching wild birds in Willamette Valley and moving them. It was the wild bird moving that actually got pheasants to
What about
take
checkers?
off. Chuckers, I don't know enough about chucker. Yeah, I don't know. And I'm not saying like 1% couldn't made it. I don't know. If it was a small percent. They released unbelievable amounts of chucker. Do you know where they first released chucker? Illinois. 500,000. They make it. Every state's released chuckers. Al Leopold called it chuckeremia. He compared it to tularemia in rabbits, the disease. It's a great article if you want to read it. But yeah, that's probably the biggest problem with the whole pen rearing thing, is overcoming those issues.
So the key to that, everybody, is come to the banquet so we have more money so we can get the wild birds and raise them right at $128.
I'll help you.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
In your earlier numbers, you were talking about, the examples you were given, we're assuming nature pretty well produces equal males and females. And all these other species, maybe the harvest is relatively even because they're not easy to distinguish on the wing. But given the fact that pheasants are almost exclusively a male harvest, does that change the numbers and change the dynamic of that whole
Yes and no.
thing?
It doesn't change anything about reproduction.
But there's a lot more females entering into the breeding season than there are males, right?
Generally, but Depends on how heavy they're harvested. So when it comes to pheasants, the literature shows that 10 to 15 hens per male is fine. A male can cover that many hens and be just fine. That means to affect the population by shooting males, you'd have to shoot over 90% of the pheasant males in a population to affect the population. So they tried to do this. There's 2 studies. They're back in the 60s. That's when all the fun research happened, by the way. It was in the 60s. But they took these biologists, there was like 4 or 5 of them, and they had these 2 wildlife areas, and they said, we are going to kill, we're taking limits off, we're going to kill as many roosters as we can out of these areas, and see if we can hurt the population by killing roosters. They got out there, and they kept track of everything, they abandoned birds, all this stuff. And what they found was they could not kill more than 60% of the roosters in a population. The other 40% became unharvestable, is how they put it. They couldn't get close enough to them to shoot them. They couldn't make it. And the bigger problem was, come spring, all those roosters were gone, and all the roosters from the outlying areas, they had as many as they started in the spring. So immigration supplanted that. I was the pheasant biologist for Kansas, and I get this question all the time. Hey, we need to reduce the ag, because Kansas is the last state to have 4 roosters a day. And I'd always answer, well, we could do 10 a day. We could do 20 a day. It wouldn't hurt the population at all. The only thing it would hurt is it could hurt your ability and somebody else's ability to get into roosters that season. You could reduce enough roosters or make them so wild that, right, they become unharvestable. But you can't hurt the population. In fact, there's an idea, and it hasn't been researched very well, but going in the winter, if you've ever watched pheasants, the males get the food first. They're pretty aggressive. If you reduce the males, you may be having females survive better. So there may be a reason to actually pull that rooster population down. I know I try to do it every time I can.
Well, that's why we pushed a few years ago to get a longer season in Utah, because we were trying to lower that rooster population. And
Don't quote me, but I agree.
I'm glad we did it, because it's nice to have that longer season.
We could go longer.
I wish we'd do it 2 months.
Go all the way to Christmas.
Yeah.
We could, yeah. Can.
Does that male to female coverage ratio change with the species that males sit next, like bob whites? Are you not necessarily better
Yeah,
off
bob whites are almost
picking white heads?
50-50 for every population. It's almost 50-50. Sage grouse are generally 2-to-1. There's about 2 females to every male. Part of that, though, is the dimorphism. So a sage grouse male is 6 pounds, a female is 3 pounds, right? It takes more resources to grow that male than the female. And so males have lower survival because it takes more resources to grow them. And that you end up with this, disparate sex ratio. So I didn't account for that in my models. I did in my publications on sage grouse. But and sage grouse are interesting because I think they're, be compared to pheasants. In a given spring, 10% of the males out there get to breed and pass their genes on. I mean, this is junior high all over again, right? 90% of the girls are looking at 10% of the males. And that's just how I look at elect. Just like going and watching junior high. And you have to be a 3-year-old male to even be considered as a sage grouse. You can't get the territory you need. And here's the other interesting thing that's really cool to me. They have research now that shows that the males that are trying to hustle the females and be aggressive, females won't have anything to do with them. The males that act like they don't care, they just standoffish, that's the one the females want. And then, I told you, it's junior high. And then once one female picks the male, you can watch it. I've watched it many times. All the females on that leg go right over that guy. And then they fight over who gets to go first. Out there. It's really interesting.
aside from control the weather, what could a landowner in northern Utah, southern Idaho do to benefit upland game?
I think the first thing is your grass cover, your herbaceous cover. Just trying to keep that in place, whether that's CRP, whether that's how you manage your wheat or whatever you're going. I know in Kansas we're trying to do cover crops aren't that big of a deal out here yet, but there's potential there. Yeah.
So I was gonna say, because they've been pushing, UDAF's been pushing the interseeding cover crops into corn. If you did that with like annual rye and maybe a clover or something, where you get that layer of green grass after it's cut and it sits there all winter about that high, would that be helpful, or is it
Yeah.
just not enough?
No.
Okay.
Pheasants, the winter wheat during nesting, it starts like this high and ends like this high.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, you guys still all have an interseeder, or is it broken down by now? With your Bear River Conservation District?
I don't know if you're talking about the chapter here.
No, I mean like the conservation
Oh.
district in this area that would benefit this chapter.
Those are, you know, some of the things. Anytime you can add forbs, there's some great pollinator programs with NRCS right now that you can get an EQIP grant and they'll have to pay for it. And, you know, those kind of things. Yeah, that's where I would. And then what species doesn't matter. What do you want? You want pheasants? Do you want huns? Do you want sharpies? You know, then I would change my tune.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, this is my question, and there might be two flaws to the logic here. So first off, I was taught, as an upland hunter, I was taught this, okay? That you don't hunt the same hillside in the same year, or in some year, sometimes you skip that hillside for a couple of years, okay? So you radiate out and hunt a bunch of spots. When I was taught, that's what I do. Should we be aging our birds when we harvest them, and if we get really good juvenile to adult ratios, meaning high juvenile, low adult ratios, it might be okay to hunt those more often.
I think that's a nice ethic to have.
Okay,
I think that'd be
so that's
reasonable.
good to take away from this. Okay,
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like you, but that's just a personal ethic.
right.
But yeah, if there's more juveniles in the population, you have really good productivity.
And the idea is, you know, maybe I can hunt that a little bit more because I'm more likely to maintain a good population. Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
What's your prediction for population?
From here on?
No. Because this isn't a no snow. Well, yeah, like this winter was
No, it's
weird.
been horrible.
Yeah. Is that good? Bad?
It's bad. It's good for overwinter survival, but that's generally not an issue for most of the birds we're interested in. I'm not going to say I'm optimistic. If we get some really good rains during the spring, what I'm talking about is during the nesting and brooding, if we can have these rains that come for like half a day and just soak in and then go away, those are great. Those are what keeps forbs growing, insects out there. That's what get, you know, nests come off and the chicks do really well. That's the hope that I have right now. Chances are that we're probably heading into a lower period.
But if we get that kind of spring where we have an increase in winter survival, like technically then we should have a good year.
No,
Get a good
because
spring.
the increase in winter survival from having a less snowy winter, less cold winter, it's only so much. It only gets you more breeding birds. But we're already, I don't know about you guys, but this last chucker season, I kept track of juvies versus adults, and I was getting like, for every 10 birds I shot, 1 or 2 would be a juvie and the rest would be adults. So we're already behind the 8 ball on that. So it for most game birds, definitely for chucker, huns, and quail, productivity is what we're living off of to get a good hunting population for hunting next year. At this point, we're not gonna get the snowpack, I don't think. And snowpack's critical to get that first flush of forbs and things going. So I'm just hoping for that spring, summer rains that aren't too heavy. Right? I'll still go hunting.
Just in Kansas, right?
No,
South Dakota.
I did. But yeah. All right, thanks everybody. I appreciate it.